All right, thanks so much. Excited to chat with you all today. Part of my session is going to be kind of a live demonstration of a couple of different AI tools that may be helpful to you all. And so that's why I'm not quite full screen. And I'll hop to some of those different tools more towards the end of the session. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a lecturer over at Auburn. I've been there about 5 years. I actually went to Alabama, so I'm a little bit torn on the Roll Tide versus War Eagle. But I teach about 200 students a year. And in addition to my work in the classroom, I'm also running a center for entrepreneurship where I'm helping both student entrepreneurs as well as community entrepreneurs. And one of the things that I help those entrepreneurs with is how can they leverage AI to really kind of improve their businesses. Now, I got into this work as an entrepreneur myself. I've started several different companies, and I'm actually currently working on a new AI startup in the health tech space to really serve some big needs in that space. So I'm not trying to come to this session, from someone that's like, oh, well, the textbook says it should be this way. I'm someone that's actively kind of living this transition in my day-to-day work, and so I hope to bring that practicality to it. As we dig in here, I feel like a lot of you are already getting probably a lot of questions about AI. It's a very dominant area of conversation. And it's not just a matter of, hey, what should I study? But it's kind of like, hey, whenever I graduate, is this even going to be a job anymore because of AI? Right. And that's a tricky question whenever you're dealing with students that are approaching graduation. But you're probably seeing a lot of that anxiety, even maybe from younger students as well. And so, I think what you've got to be aware of is just how quickly the field is moving. And it's probably more difficult for advising to be able to keep up with those rapid changes. And so for y'all, I think sometimes you might be in between a rock and a hard place between the questions that you're being asked and what resources are actually available. So hopefully today's session can maybe help close a little bit of that gap and provide some ways that you can respond to some of those questions, or some different suggestions that you can provide to those students that are asking you these things. I'm going to start by kind of talking about expectations. I think a lot of AI presentations are very much kind of focused on the tech and all of those aspects. I'm not here to be a cheerleader for AI. I do use it every day. But I also do have those genuine concerns about its impacts and where it's heading. I think job displacement is a real thing. And it's not just a talking point. There's issues around bias, around equity, even around safety. So I'm going to try to cover a little bit of both sides today, because I think it's a multi-sided conversation, right? And I also think, frankly, if I came in here and said, "Hey, AI is all upside, it's all roses," y'all would know better, and you would probably push back and say, "No, there's some real issues and trends that we're seeing here." My hope is that by the end of today's session, that you leave with at least one thing, one kind of practical thing that you can either say to a student this week as they ask you some of these questions, or maybe you've left with a particular tool or something else that may be really useful to your particular work. And if we can accomplish that, I think that's a win. So, I do want to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of how we'll go through today. I've got about 45 minutes worth of content, just depending on some of the demos and things. But there will be time for question and answer. I'm going to start with a little bit of context, trying to kind of set up, some of the transition that we're seeing. And then I'm going to transition a little bit more into what maybe some of the workforce opportunities are, maybe sharing a little bit of stories and data along the way. And then towards the end, I'm going to be talking about a few particular tools that may be helpful to you. And maybe that will be some things that may be useful that you could share with your students, or some things that you might be able to implement yourself in some of your work, to make your lives easier. Um, so to dig into some of this, I just want to say that disruption is real, right? And this disruption is not something that we're seeing for the first time. Actually, if we look historically, there's a broader pattern of some of this disruption, right? In 1476, there were a group of scribes, and this happened out in Paris, that were attacking and physically destroying printing presses, right? And the reason they were doing that was not them being irrational. Their profession, which had required years of training, and it was really their livelihood, their identity, that was being automated away, right? And so those scribes guilds across Europe were smashing these printing presses. They were, intimidating printers. They wanted the government to ban the technology, right? Even some religious leaders called printed books the devil's work, right? One abbot wrote about this, arguing that the monks who weren't doing the hand copying were just spiritually lazy, right? And I think some of those trends that we saw historically there might sound very familiar, right? And it's not just that far back in history. If you fast forward to the 20th century, there was this career of elevator operators. Every elevator in America, that they were, having these operators, and they went on strike in 1945. I believe it was about 1.5 million office workers couldn't get to work, and it had a huge economic impact of over $100 million, right? And that was because, again, that career was being automated away. There was a physical person in the elevator that would control the elevator and take you to the proper floors. And as that work was being automated away, these folks went on strike, and it had these huge economic disruptions and outcomes. But what ended up happening is the technology still marched forward, right? Within 2 decades, that whole profession was essentially gone, right? In fact, it's one of the only occupations that was actually removed from the U.S. Census because of automation, right? And so both these scribes and these elevator operators, they had legitimate fears. They were right that, their roles were going to be changing dramatically. But also, that transition, was a painful process that they were going through. And so I think for your students, they are trying to navigate some of these transitions too, right? And some may be very resistant to technology, right? So I would say AI is maybe moving faster than some of these transitions in the past, right? The scribes or the elevator operators had decades. We might not have that luxury, right? So I think we need to acknowledge that, but I don't think it's all bad either, right? So, I want to first acknowledge that yes, there is legitimate fear. And if that's something that we're kind of having to deal with, there could be job cuts as a result of this, right? I think in the US, it's something like 55,000 jobs as of last year were attributed to a result of some of the AI changes that we're seeing, right? And that number is probably an undercount. You see a lot of, I'm in a college setting. I see a lot of graduates that are coming out and struggling to get some of those entry level jobs, right? Um, and so there is a real concern here. There is a legitimate fear. And I think it's probably hitting some of these early entry level roles, perhaps the most. Um, and in some areas that maybe traditionally were thought to be very safe, such as software engineering or coding, right? Um, and so, how do we respond to this? I think is really an important aspect, because ultimately your students are probably going to be asking, whether their chosen career field is safe, right? And for many fields, I think it's going to depend not on kind of their major or their minor or whatever. It's going to depend on how they prepare. And so that's what more of today's conversation is really meant to try to do, is help with that preparation and help with some of that discussion. that may be forthcoming down the pike, right? So let's talk about what changes and what may not change, right? This is I feel like is a useful framework, right? Instead of just kind of trying to say, oh, all programming jobs are going to be gone, that's a terrible career, right? Or legal jobs or whatever other career, like all those jobs are going to be gone, it's going to be disrupted. I think it's better to kind of reframe how we're thinking about this. And I think it tends to be those very routine, repetitive tasks, data entry, maybe super basic customer support, templated writing, right? Very basic research tasks. I think those jobs where that's kind of the main thing that you're doing, those risks are very real and something that we should acknowledge. But I think there's also where you can see more of a pairing with AI, right? AI is maybe used to assist, but it's probably not going to take over the job entirely. Areas such as legal research, medical diagnosis, market research, right? There's going to be some pressure in those areas, but I think it's going to be an opportunity to maybe work with AI in some of those fields to have the best outcomes. Those that are kind of non-AI native and don't have those skills, I think are going to find a harder time. And so, you know, as we look over time, what you're going to see is people that are working alongside AI, regardless of career, right? I think those are going to be the ones that are going to be able to override some of these changes, right? And have more adaptability and respond to some of these changes. And there's going to be an increasing gap, right? There are people today that are very anti-AI and they're very much like, I'm not gonna use it, I'm not gonna download it, I'm not gonna try it. And I think that is maybe a bad approach to take. Now, that doesn't mean that you want to hand off all of your critical thinking skills to AI either, right? If you saw the opening keynote, there was the example of the person going into the convenience store and trying to order something, and they couldn't even really think or talk because they had handed off so much critical thinking to AI. And so this is the balance that I think is important to strike. And I would say maybe as you talk to students, it's not so much that AI is coming to take all these jobs, right? I think it's more that there are going to be people that know how to use AI and they're going to maybe have a larger impact in organizations. And so they want to probably be one of those people that knows how to use it, that can have that larger impact, and then hence becomes maybe more valuable to the organization, right? And this is something within our state, within Alabama, it is happening, right? I think oftentimes when you picture AI, in your mind you might have this notion of Silicon Valley, right? And of course that's where many of these firms are based, but there's a physical reality that's different, right? AI requires huge amounts of power, cooling, physical space, data centers, right? They're essentially these big industrial facilities, and they have to be built, they have to be maintained, they have to be operated by skilled workers, right? In the state of Alabama, there's at least 19 data centers, right, either in operation or under construction, and that's according to the Alabama Department of Commerce, right? Meta Facebook alone has committed more than 3 billion, right, between some of their upcoming campuses. And these data centers are really optimized for AI workloads, right? Here in the Auburn area where I'm at, right? There's a company called Core Scientific. They announced a $135 million investment to expand data center in Auburn, right? And their hope is to grow that to more than 400 million over time, right? So there are jobs that are going to be tied to these facilities and to this expansion, right? Those jobs could include project managers, electrical contractors, HVAC and cooling technicians, security, facility operations, right? And so there are still going to be some of these entry level roles that are going to be available. And these roles may not require a 4 year college degree, right? Maybe a certificate or an associate's degree would be sufficient. So I think that can be a real opportunity for some of the students and some of the workforce ahead, right? And so I would say, this notion that kind of like you have to um I don't know, move to the Bay Area, move to the coast to get involved in AI, or that's where all of these things are happening is not really accurate, right? I would say these things are already impacting us here within the state of Alabama. And so we want to kind of respond and prepare our future workforce so they can see some of these opportunities. And sometimes those opportunities might be different from what folks originally thought. For many years, kind of the approach would be, hey, go to college and get a 4 year degree and get that 4 year degree in software engineering, get it in computer science. And that's how you're going to have all these job prospects and all of these things. And that may not be the type of advice that we continue to give as we go forward. Right. So let's try to get into a little bit more specifics here. And talk about some of these jobs and talk about some of these things. So when I think we talk about software engineers, job growth is actually happening in a lot of different areas, and it's not necessarily software engineers. You might think you see how quickly ChatGPT or Claude or all these tools are advancing, and you might think they've got to be hiring so many programmers to make these advances, and that may not actually be what's happening underneath the hood, right? I think some of the growth we're seeing is broader and in fact maybe more accessible, right? If we just look at construction jobs that are tied to data centers, there's perhaps hundreds of thousands of jobs and opportunities in that space, and we've talked about what those specific roles could be, ranging from electrical contractors to HVAC and so forth, right? And, you know, I don't know how quickly robots are going to get there, but I think it's going to be a while before you're going to see a robot that's going to be able to, wire up all this HVAC and handle all of those kind of physical tasks and electrical tasks and things that are needed to really kind of bring some of these things online. So I think there is some staying power to the growth in those types of jobs as well, right? And this is going to probably increase over time. You're seeing continued expansion with more data center demand, more power demands, right, from AI infrastructure. And so it could be up to 500,000 jobs that are going to be kind of created in that space to support that power expansion and that data center expansion. And I think even Alabama Power is looking at expanding the grid, expanding line transmissions, and some of those things. So they're part of that story as well. I think also healthcare is a huge creator within AI adjacent jobs, right? There are positions related to maybe diagnostics, analytics, patient support that are maybe AI adjacent, right? We have an aging population in this country, and there might not be enough healthcare workers to handle that influx of demand that we're seeing. And so I think you might not have traditionally thought of healthcare as being a very AI adjacent field, but to meet this influx of demand, I think we're going to increasingly see more need for some of that AI fluency in some of these areas, right? Even nurse practitioners, I think it's projected to grow like something like 52% over the coming decade, right? So the pattern here matters as you're working with students, as you're thinking about the workforce of the future, right? It's not that students that are the quote unquote the most technical students that are the best at programming that are going to be the only ones that have career opportunities going forward, right? I think it's going to be also those students that are maybe entering trades, entering healthcare, entering logistics, right? All of those students are going to have great job opportunities as well. but I think they are going to be stronger candidates if they are approaching those job opportunities with AI fluency and AI knowledge, right? It's the same careers, right? They're still working in healthcare, they're still working in logistics or business or whatever the case, but with that AI fluency, they become more competitive. And maybe some of the work they're doing within that career that has existed for a long time is now a little bit different type of work, right? And so, I want to kind of stay concrete here. We've talked about some of these different trades and different things that we're seeing here. I think another area that I want to kind of lean into is marketing and sales specifically. Because what are we seeing with kind of some of especially the growth in like vibe coding, this ability for almost anyone to kind of create an app, right? Well, I think the difference we're seeing is if anyone can create an app, now the world, the whole industry is flooded with more apps, more businesses, more opportunities, right? And so it becomes really important for marketing and sales to be a differentiator. If there are all these apps, if there are millions and millions of apps flooding the marketplace, right? Someone that is really able to build relationships, someone that's really able to break through from that flood of sometimes it's called AI slop, right? Is going to be someone that is probably very valuable, right? The differentiator is not who can produce the most content. The differentiator isn't who can produce the most lines of code. It's really more someone who can build trust, someone who can have the right strategy behind it, someone that can actually cut through all of that noise. And I think that is a human skill set, right? And so students need to be aware of that shift. Um, I think another thing that we're seeing is touching on just kind of this notion of AI slop and kind of the inundation that we're seeing of some of these things. There might be targeted areas that actually grow in terms of job opportunities. And in particular, what I'm thinking about here in the field of entrepreneurship, for many, many years, kind of the specifics were you're a business student, you've got this cool idea, and you're stuck until you can find that technical person, right? Now, for many of these entrepreneurs, many of these business students, what they're seeing is, hey, I can work with this particular AI tool and I can vibe code and I can kind of build kind of a rough version of what I want. And that may in fact be true. But unfortunately, many times that kind of rough version is not built for the long term. It's not built sustainably. And there's a lot of rework and improvement that's human led that really is needed. And so I think there are probably going to be opportunities for basically folks that are more technical to go back and clean up some of this AI slop that we're seeing, right? And so I think a common thread across some of these things is, you don't have to be an AI expert, a data engineer, a machine learning savant to benefit from AI, right? You need to be the person in your field that knows how to use it, that knows how to leverage it, and that can maybe separate you from some of the other folks that are in your particular field, right? And I think there are some things that AI isn't going to be able to easily replace, and I want to be cautious here because technology marches quickly, and so, I can't claim, that there's not going to be any change over time or additional disruption as we see some of these trends within AI change over time. But you'll hear people say that AI can't make ethical decisions, and that's not quite right. AI is already being used to assist with medical triage, to maybe help with some criminal risk and sentencing recommendations, and maybe in some cases screening job applicants. Right? Those are consequential decisions, and for many many years, those decisions were handled exclusively with humans. Right? And so I think you still want to have a human in the loop. You want to have a human that's accountable, right? Because ultimately, if you have a machine involved, mistakes can be made, and sometimes these things are pushing forward too quickly, and I think these are some areas where AI can genuinely struggle, right? Um, I think if you could have AI jobs that are maybe able to do some of these routine tasks, pattern recognition, data processing, some of those things pretty easily. Whenever you have some of these more contextual things, some of these nuanced things, it's probably more of a pair, right? Where the AI is handling some aspects, but the human is handling some aspects, and that's the way to be most effective, right? And so this is probably part of the skills that you want to help develop for students, right? It's not just career specific skills, but it's some of these collaborative skills as well, and really some of these nuanced skills that are really important. And that can be hard to build. If all of your kind of cognitive load is constantly handed off to AI, right? And so I think the goal is not to kind of just be like, hey, I'm doing this super nuanced thing and I'm completely irreplaceable because I'm doing this nuanced thing, and I'm human, and I have all this great judgment. I think the goal is to kind of say, I'm the human. I have this nuanced judgment. I have this skill. I might be able to utilize AI to kind of provide some initial support, but ultimately, I've got this skill that I can handle things and do things that maybe AI wouldn't have been able to do on its own, right? And so what I think I'm trying to get here is you don't have to be a tech expert. Probably many of you on this call are not tech experts, right? Many of your students are not tech experts, right? Um, and so for a period of time, you might think of an AI career as being that data scientist or whatever the case, the software engineer. And I think that framing is too narrow, right? There are real paths that are going to be available to students. And so, it's not, hey, is this field going to be impacted by AI? Because I think it is going to be impacted. It's more, how can you work alongside AI, right? You might have a nursing student, right? If they graduate knowing how to use AI documentation, if they graduate knowing how to maybe leverage AI to help with diagnostics, if they graduate, really knowing when maybe a human override is going to be most important, right? They're going to be more competitive. They've got the same degree as their peers. They're in the same field, but they're going to have different outcomes, right? You could take logistics, right? Construction management, marketing, right? The fields, are still going to be there, but some of the skill sets are going to be changing, right? Especially with the rapid rise of tooling that we're going to touch on in just a few slides, right? And so I think this might, in some ways, be good news for some of the students that you're working with, right? Because it means they don't have to completely pivot their careers. Maybe they are still interested in a given field, but they do have to have awareness and intentionality building kind of these key skills, so that they can work successfully with AI in the workplace, right? And this is actually even something we are starting to see in the field. Some employees, their performance is being vetted upon by how many AI tokens they are spending, right? Are you a strong employee? I don't know if you're that strong of an employee because you didn't use enough AI tokens in your work, right? And that's a pretty interesting thing, that kind of gets at the heart of this, that that employee may not be an expert, but they're really leveraging AI to improve their output and their efficiency in their work. So as you have maybe some of these conversations, as you're trying to work with different students or different folks that have some of these fears, I would just encourage you to kind of reframe things a little bit, right? if you're saying, will AI affect this career, that tends to be pretty binary, yes or no. And the answer is probably always yes to some degree, right? Um, I think it's better to start to see how is AI maybe changing the field, right? And what does that mean for your students, and how should they best prepare, right? If AI is maybe impacting marketing and allowing you to generate more deliverables at a higher scale, right? That doesn't mean that marketing and marketers are going to go away. It just means that maybe you're going to have to better frame some of that work, better have that nuance to some of that work, to analyze some of that work so that it can make the best impact for the clients that those marketers are working with, right? And to be clear, you know, there's a lot of different fields here. You don't have to be the expert in every field. You just have to be willing to kind of sit down and talk with students that, you know, hey, yes, AI is changing a lot in the economy as we go forward, right? And having that posturing that you're aware that these things are changing, but also having some positivity that they can equip themselves with some of these skills if they lean in, I think is something that can be really valuable for students. The strategy is not avoidance. If you just avoid it, right? I worry that you are kind of like those folks that were antithetical to the printing press or the automated elevators, right? And so you want to kind of get beyond that. And so I would encourage you to maybe think of AI a little bit more as a co-pilot, right? And that's more of the some of the framing around this talk more broadly, not a replacement. I think sometimes as educators, and this is true in my classroom as well, I don't want people just kind of offloading all their critical thinking skills, right? I don't want I don't want the AI to write their entire business plan and the student didn't write any of their business plan. They didn't have any thought, any nuance, right? Um, so a co-pilot is not flying the plane, right? A co-pilot is helping to fly the plane. The professional is still in control. The co-pilot might make it easier. They're handling tasks that could otherwise consume some mental energy, but they're doing that co-pilot, if we're thinking about in a flight context, they're doing things so the human can focus on the things that really require human judgment and that really matter, right? And so I think in your role, it might mean that in some cases, AI handled a first draft of a particular piece of communication. Maybe this is something like if there's a note to a parent, AI could handle perhaps an early draft. Maybe it could help capture some notes from an advising session or something like that, right? And that's allowing you to stay more engaged in that session, right? But in neither case is it kind of the final arbiter, right? If AI does an initial draft, that's not the final draft that's going to be sent out. If AI does some note taking or something like that, it's only in the sense that it's allowing you to stay more engaged during that session, and you're going to go back and review and polish those things up before they're fully saved, right? I think for your students, if they can better leverage this, they have better tools as they enter the workforce, right? So whenever you think of AI more in the sense of a co-pilot, you're really not thinking about it being something that's going to replace you, going to replace your job. You're thinking of it as something that's going to allow you to up your capacity. And that's how I prefer to try to think about it. I know for myself, within some of my work at the university, last year we did 50 events, y'all. 50. That's in addition to teaching. That's in addition to, my time doing student consultations and so forth. And AI helped me level up to be able to achieve that, right? Um, and without it, I probably wouldn't have been able to achieve that. And so I think for counselors and coaches and other folks working with students, you might be able to leverage AI in some of your work to maybe better increase efficiency and have a greater impact because you have some of those co-pilots available to you, right? So, I think we've got about 10 or so minutes, 15 minutes, something like that remaining before Q&A. And so what I wanted to try to do for this last portion is try to get into a few tools. And I think we're all very familiar with ChatGPT at this point in time. And so I'm going to show just a few different tools that are not ChatGPT. Maybe you've seen or worked with them all or worked with similar tools. Maybe you haven't worked with those tools. And the hope is maybe one of these is something that you're like, oh yeah, I could utilize something like that. Something like that would be helpful. Now, before we get into the tool specifics and some of the demos, I want to just go through a couple quick things. First is some questions, right? Because there are literally thousands of these tools out there, and many more being launched every day, right? So the landscape can be very overwhelming. And so I think these couple of questions can kind of help filter out, is this something you should think about using or not? The first is it going to save you time, right? And not trivial time, meaningful time. If something's going to save you 30 seconds and you do it once a week, probably not worth adopting that tool. All right. However, if something is going to really save you meaningful time, it's something you do very frequently and it's making that stronger, more efficient, higher quality, right? Then maybe it is something that you should consider, right? And the second is really around maybe the quality, right? Um, it's not so much the speed, but it's the quality, right? And so you want any AI tools that you're considering adopting to pass at least one of these as a yes, right? And that's for you in your specific situation, right? If it's not passing one of these, skip it. Don't use it, right? For me, the tools that I'm going to show, they pass at least one of those tests for me and some of my work, and maybe they would pass some of that test for some of you on the call and some of your work as well. Right. So I'm gonna talk about in a few different areas. I'm gonna talk about note taking. I'm gonna talk about maybe some of the writing process, maybe some of the research process, and then even something that maybe students could benefit from as well. Right. And I'm gonna kind of navigate away from my presentation and try to show you how some of these things work. I'll be clear at the onset, there are many, many, many tools that are out there, and these are just a few that I personally like. But I'm not claiming that these are the best ones or the only ones or whatever the case. If you've got a different one that works for you, awesome. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Fireflies. Fireflies is an AI powered note taker. And I recently had a meeting literally yesterday. And it was like a hour plus long meeting, and we were planning out some summer workshops. And this meeting uh, had lots of people in the meeting and lots of different ideas being thrown around. And instead of us kind of like focus so much on writing down every bullet point from the meeting, this just ran in the background. Now, one thing I should mention is Alabama is a one-party consent state for recordings, right? In certain states, it's a two-party state. You have to make sure both parties agree for a meeting to be recorded. And I do think that that is still always the best practice. Oftentimes, you'll see these kind of AI note takers join in a call or something like that, or you'll just simply say, "Hey, I've got an AI note taker. Do you mind if it records this session?" Right. And so once everybody's okay with that, it can actually provide something that's really useful. So it captured this entire meeting. It captured all these notes. It captured like some of the logistics that we were talking about. And it even captured action items. And the nice thing about this is there are legitimate timestamps for all of this. So if I want to go back to any point in the conversation, I can go back to that point and I can rehear it and make sure that it captured that accurately. Now, it's kind of a trust but verify sort of thing, because I'm going to show you right here. There was no one that was sending a meeting invitation for April 2022. This meeting happened yesterday. We're sending a meeting invitation for April 2026, right? So there might be some cleanup and some things like that needed, but this is really helpful. And in fact, our next meeting is going to be in a few weeks, in kind of mid to late April. Now, if I have not looked at this for those weeks, and I'm kind of like trying to prep for that. Something that I really like about this is there's this feature where I can ask Fred. There's a long transcript. There was a lot of back and forth, and I could ask it, "Hey, when were we planning to launch this session? Where were we thinking of hosting it?" If I don't recall that, right, it's going to look at the transcript. It's going to look up those dates. It's going to look up the location, and it's going to figure all that stuff out for me, so I don't have to read back through an entire super long transcript of all of these details. I can just ask the AI and it's going to kind of try to find out that information for me, right? And all of the different note takers don't have this kind of particular functionality, but I think it is something that will grow increasingly common. And so, what I would say with the note takers is, if you're a counselor, if you're someone that's advising, I know for me as an entrepreneur, sometimes I'm kind of splitting attention. This is something that can really help me stay engaged. And then be able to refer back to that whenever the time comes, whenever I'm prepping for that next session. It can be super helpful. Otter is probably the most popular in this space. It's called Otter.ai, but there's many, many different AI note-taking tools. The next one that I want to talk about is related to research. There is a tool called Perplexity that I think can be helpful with the research process. And in particular, what I think is useful about this, I'm just going to, where I typically utilize it is for kind of some initial research of things that I might typically have done with Google, right? I might have searched Google if I'm really trying to see, hey, which AI tools are going to help me best write in all of those things. And I'm really considering Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini or Copilot, right? I'm going to have to search up blog posts. I'm going to have to look at those blog posts. Do I trust this person? Whatever, whatever. Um, I can use Perplexity to kind of do that research for me, build me a comparison table, see kind of some of the key details, key limitations, and all of that is a super fast, easy process. And so that's something that I use pretty frequently, kind of as the initial step, right? We're probably all very familiar with ChatGPT and some of these tools. I personally have kind of grown to really like and appreciate Claude as an alternative. And when you're writing, something that I find myself having to do many times is recommendation letters. And so here I'm asking Claude, because I feel like it's a little bit more nuanced than some of these things, to write me a college recommendation letter for one of the students that I might have, right? And it provides that initial draft. And I had to put in here some additional context about their skills, about some of the things that they do. And it writes that initial draft. And maybe that initial draft is like, okay, right? It's probably not perfect. It probably needs a little bit of refinement. And so I could then, essentially tell it, hey, I want to rewrite this, make it warmer, right? Add this line because I know the student is really interested in healthcare, right? Use more of my personal voice, right? If I've been using this tool frequently, it knows more of my personal voice. It knows kind of my mannerisms and my speaking style. And now it's giving me a fresh draft that feels a little bit more authentic, that feels a little bit more in my voice. And this is the type of technique that you could use. I'm sure y'all are probably having to do lots of letters or recommendations. I know that I am. No, I'm not going to just copy and paste this and send it. But as an initial draft, instead of me kind of just looking at a template that maybe I would have pulled off the internet or something, I feel like this is actually stronger and more useful. The last tool that I want to kind of demo in this section here is related to something that maybe students will be able to benefit from. And so the way that I've got this set up, this is a tool called Notebook LM. It's provided by Google. And Notebook LM, what it allows you to do is create a notebook, and inside that notebook, you can put lots of different files, right? And so in this case, what I had is I was judging a competition, a hackathon, and there were all these different startups that had all these different business plans or different ideas or whatever, and all of these are separate PDFs, right? And I had to drive a few hours to drive over to this hackathon. I simply downloaded all of the PDFs, I threw it into Notebook LM, and within Notebook LM, I was able to create a podcast out of this, right? And it created a podcast across all of these different PDF files, and I could listen to that podcast on the drive over to the event. And so then whenever I'm trying to judge this competition, or whenever I'm trying to, maybe help provide some guidance or some feedback to these students or whatever the case, I now know a little bit more about their business because I've listened to it. And I haven't had to read, whatever, 10-page business plans times 20 plus students. For my purposes, I was really looking at judging their pitching, and this was just a little bit of additional context. I wasn't trying to, like grade this like a term paper where I had a close rubric and I needed to look at all these different details. And Notebook LM is something that's growing over time. They've added pieces where they can generate reports, quizzes, I think even slide decks. And so that might be something that your students could really utilize. You could use it yourselves, but your students could probably get some value out of that as well. Right. So, as we come to a close, I just want to say, there's a real difference between AI is a shortcut. It's taking over all my critical thinking, it's doing all the stuff for me versus thinking of it like a true co-pilot. I'm offloading some of the more difficult pieces or some of the pieces that I might typically struggle with, and it's allowing me to focus on the most important pieces better and to maybe be more efficient, be more impactful with some of my work. And for y'all, there's probably so much that you're already doing. You don't have to do it all. You don't have to become an AI expert. Just start with one tool, right? Try to start to utilize that tool, utilize it for one student, for one conversation that you're working with one workflow, right? Hey, if I could just be a little bit more efficient on turning around these letters of recommendation, that would really help a lot of the students that I'm working with or whatever. And that could have a big impact. The last thing that I'll share before I open it up for questions is something that I do a lot whenever I talk about this, is just how quickly this space is moving. This is a tool called Dares and AI for that. And specifically, it showcases that there are over 47,000 different AI tools out there. And if I check this same website tomorrow, there's probably going to be close to 48,000. Like, I mean, the field is moving that rapidly. Now, you could search in here and you could say, hey, I need AI to help with podcasting, right? Because I want to start a podcast. And there are 69 different AI tools that can help with podcasts, right? And you could choose to, filter on based on, what has the most upvotes or what's most popular or what's got the most links or whatever the case. But this just shows that the field is moving extremely quickly, right? You might even look for different AIs that can help with some of your personal workflows or some of these things. But know that the field is moving really quickly, and it's going to be important to leverage some of these tools so that we can really have the biggest impact. So I hope that's been helpful to you. I think we've got around 10 minutes or so left. I want to transition and open it up for any questions that we may have.
I'll ask a question. So as educational institutes continue to struggle with implementing like AI policies, do you have like any thoughts about having like an effective AI policy that utilizes new technology while encouraging students to grow their critical thinking?
Yeah, so I've got about 200 students that I work with every year. And so in my classroom, I've got a policy that's basically they can use AI for certain assignments in certain ways, and I want them to, but they can't use it for every assignment and in every way. And so, a good example of that might be, I teach entrepreneurship, so during the ideation process things like naming their business. So many students would get hung up on trying to come up with that great idea, trying to come up with that proper business name, and that they will waste an inordinate amount of time on that. Please use AI to come up with the ideas, to come up with naming, to come up with those pieces. But then you cannot use AI to write your entire business plan for your final submission for your group project, right? And so that's kind of an example of how I've leveraged that. And in my class in particular, we do have some exams. And so with our exams, I utilize the lockdown browser. So they're not able to open up AI tools or other tools while they're taking that exam, right? Um, Great question. I see a couple of things in the comments. Leslie, I'm so happy that you enjoyed some of the tools. There's just so many different ones out there. And again, go to there's an AI for that, and you'll find just tens of thousands more. Uh, Juanetta mentioned that they're using AI for drafts. Um, what would I recommend as the safe ideal percentage of AI detection within a document? Okay, so um, I'm gonna maybe have a little bit of a hot take here, but I'm gonna be real with y'all. I am a startup founder. I'm currently building an AI startup, and I previously worked on an AI startup that was in the text analysis space. I do not know that I really trust AI detectors, right? With any level of confidence. I have seen many situations where an AI detector will flag something that is completely real, completely authentic, completely personally written by somebody as AI generated, right? And so I don't use any AI detector in my course. That's my personal opinion because I don't trust the accuracy of those tools typically. I think there's a different approach that you can use that is somewhat interesting and maybe a little bit more low tech, but I think can still be impactful. Um, if you made your students write their paper in Microsoft Word, right? And you turned on track changes. If you saw somebody paste in four paragraphs at once, they probably copied and pasted that from AI, right? But if you saw every word, every sentence being typed out slowly as you see that version history and that track changes, that gives you a better sense that it's more authentic writing, right? And I believe even Grammarly has a tool called authorship that is kind of trying to solve it in a similar fashion. Not detector just kind of analyzing this huge block of text and trying to guess whether it was AI generated or not, but looking at the process of how that text was input, how that text was written, and trying to backtrack from there. Let's see. Helpful information. Embrace AI. Yes. Don't feel threatened by it. 100%. It's a tool. Yes. Oh, glad that you liked it. Elizabeth, Latasha, glad that you liked some of the resources. And AI as a quote, right? Look, I wouldn't want to fly in a plane if there was no co-pilot, y'all. Like honestly, like I want there to be a co-pilot in the cockpit in the plane, right? So I think that's how we look at it. Um, oh, okay, we had somebody that uploaded their paper in the AI detector, and it was a high percentage, and you knew you were the authentic author. Yep, that's exactly right. So I'm glad to hear that. Other questions from the group? I think we've still got a few minutes left. I'm happy to answer any questions y'all might have. Michelle, you got any questions for me? I feel like I just wanted to shout you out as like the one person with the camera on. That was clutch. I could see it looked like you were taking some notes or something. I was like, okay, I haven't lost them. So, any questions, anything I can help you with?
No, I was listening. It's really interesting, and thanks for sharing. Yeah, I'm definitely going to try out some of those things that you mentioned.
Awesome. So happy to hear it. Well, the field is moving super quickly. I'll say from a entrepreneurship kind of business context, for many years, whenever I've been working with these entrepreneurs, um, they have kind of been at a disadvantage, right? They're competing against this larger firm, and they've got an entire marketing department, with multiple people in that role, and there are one or two entrepreneurs trying to compete against them. With AI now, they can maybe have more of that assistance, have more of that kind of level set to try to compete against some of those larger firms. But the entrepreneurs have to be willing to leverage it and willing to upskill so they can compete in that way.